Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 109, Australia's first native-born explorer. Hamilton Hume was Australia's first native-born explorer, and this is his story and the story of his family. Hamilton's father was Andrew Hamilton Hume, and he was born on the 24th of June 1762 at Beachfield, Hillsborough, Antrim, Northern Ireland, the son of James Hume, a Presbyterian minister, and his wife Isabella Hamilton. They were both of Scottish lineage and they moved to Ireland in 1746. During his 21 years in Ireland, Andrew Hume apparently learnt a considerable amount about the processing and growing of flax. His education was sufficient to procure him a commission in the Moira Regiment of Volunteers in 1782, commanded by Sir Francis Rawdon. Andrew Hume's regiment is said to have been stationed near Greenwich in 1786, and it was in that year, during a parade, a senior mounted officer was to say something to Andrew Hume, to which he took immediate offence. His violent temper flared, and he grabbed the leg of his superior and he tossed him out of the saddle onto the ground. Only one outcome in this day and age between the gentlemen was a duel. It is believed that Andrew was to severely wound his opponent, but this would have been an unpardonable attack. It would have prevented him in the future of any government position, of which he did subsequently hold. So it's very likely he was asked to resign his commission. He rapidly lost all his friends and was without a job, and it appears he cut himself off from his family in Ulster. Sir Francis Rawdon befriended Andrew, found him a job with Duncan Campbell as Superintendent of Convicts on the convict hulks of Greenwich. It was fortunate for Andrew at this time that the Home Government was looking for men to instruct its prisoners in the colony in agriculture and mechanics. Andrew was one of 8 that was selected to set out to Australia on the 10th of September 1789 as an agricultural instructor to convicts on the frigate Guardian, which was taking convicts and supplies for the first settlers. He was granted a salary of £40 per annum on the strength of his flax knowledge. The ship had a good run to the Cape, which she left on the 11th of December 1789. It was 1,300 miles out amongst floating ice that she struck an undersea portion of a huge iceberg. 5 lifeboats got away, but only one survived. They were picked up by a French ship, and the survivors landed back at the Cape. Some 60-odd were to remain with the Guardian, which had a large hole and was sinking. It is not known if Andrew Hume remained with the ship or he was in the boat that was picked up by the French. It is said that Andrew lost all of his hair due to exposure and was forever after wearing a wig, which suggests he was in the open boat. At the Cape, the Lady Juliana, which had left England with 226 female convicts, picked up the survivors and salvaged what they could from the Guardian and set sail for Port Jackson. On board was Andrew Hume. The Lady Juliana arrived on the 3rd of June 1790 and was the first ship to arrive after the First Fleet. 3 months later, Governor Arthur Phillip immediately sent him to Norfolk Island to help Lieutenant Governor Philip Gidley King in the production of flax. He left with a reasonable proportion of goods from the Lady Juliana's cargo, set out for and reached Norfolk Island. It was here that he went to work at what was known as Phillipsburg on the native flax. In 1791, Hume reported progress to Phillip and asked for further aid in the form of looms, spinning wheels, and in particular weavers' brushes, oil, and different sets of stays. The flax industry, however, failed to come up to expectations, and in 1792 Hume returned to Sydney. Lieutenant Governor Francis Grose appointed him Superintendent of Convicts at Toongabbie, and next year granted him 30 acres of land at an annual rent of 1 shilling. Andrew called it Hume Farm. He married Elizabeth Moore Kennedy on the 29th of September 1796 by Reverend Samuel Marsden. Elizabeth was the daughter of Reverend John Kennedy and Mary Aspey and was born in 1760 at Nettlestead, Kent, England. It was said that Eliza was named after the well-known authoress and philanthropist Hannah More. Her father, John Kennedy, was rector at Nettlestead. Elizabeth's mother died in 1770, and so Elizabeth accompanied her widowed half-brother James and his 3 girls to the colony. One of her nieces married into the Broughton family from episode 42. She arrived on the ship the Royal Sovereign on the 5th of November 1875. Upon her arrival, she obtained a matronship at the orphanage at Parramatta. How she obtained this position so easily? Well, she had prior involvement in a Sunday school for the poor and uneducated in Teston, no doubt linked with her father being the Reverend. In 1798, Governor John Hunter appointed Hume government storekeeper at Parramatta, but soon afterwards Hume was tried for malversation of public property in the Parramatta granary. Although acquitted, he was dismissed for irregularities in his administration. In 1800, he was appointed superintendent of livestock, but was soon being tried on a charge of rape. Again, he was acquitted and the case dismissed, but Governor King described him at this time as a worthless character. Elizabeth's position of matronship at the Parramatta orphanage meant that she was the first woman appointed to a public position in New South Wales, and she received a salary of £40 per annum. She retired from this position because she stated that she had some unpleasant domestic circumstances and an increase of family. Andrew Hume was definitely a scallywag in his younger days. He had a wild, reckless disposition. He balked at authority and a temper that fled quickly, as outlined in The Jewel. Many who knew him said that he was a humane man and extremely charming if he chose to be, but he had a wholesome hatred of the system under which he was forced to work to live during his first years in the colony. However, he was hard-working and he was a very successful farmer, and it was believed that he had a brilliant tenor voice. After Elizabeth's resignation, the family appears to have settled at the Hawkesbury River, but were dogged by misfortune, losing everything twice by fire and once by floods in 1806. After Governor King left, Hume ostensibly supported Governor William Bligh, but after Bligh's arrest, he signed the congratulatory address to Lieutenant Governor George Johnston in 1808. Johnston then reinstated Hume in his former position as Superintendent of Stock, and according to Commissary John Palmer, he was granted 2 cows from government stock. But when Lieutenant Governor Joseph Forveau arrived, Hume was dismissed again for indications of dishonesty. According to his wife, they would have starved, especially after those floods, had it not been for the cow that was given by Johnston. Governor William Patterson's wife, who was patroness of the orphan school, recommended Elizabeth for a grant of land, and her husband, Lieutenant Governor William Patterson, gave her 60 acres of Prospect Hill, a grant which Governor Macquarie confirmed. And as a result, she was one of the first women in the colony to receive a land and cattle grant. The family gradually achieved the respectability that Hume's former conduct had jeopardised, and in 1811, Governor Macquarie gave Andrew a further 100 acres at Appin. After Macquarie departed, Hume acquired more land at Appin and concentrated on grazing. In 1825, he threatened to seize stock on agistment from George Crossley unless he paid his debts. Hume's name appeared on the list of grand jurors in 1826. Elizabeth was an accomplished woman of equable nature, and she was the perfect foil for her unpredictable husband, and she gave all her 4 children, particularly her son Hamilton, the rudiments of a sound education. In later years, Elizabeth was said to have found a home on a station in northwest Victoria for the last of the Wiradjuri tribe. Elizabeth died on the 15th of August 1847 in Gunning, New South Wales, at the age of 87. And the notice wrote, at the residence of her son, Mrs. Elizabeth Moore Hume, wife of Andrew Hamilton Hume, Esquire, in her 87th year. Mrs. Hume arrived in the colony with her brother, Mr. James Kennedy, in 1795. She was the daughter of the late Reverend John Kennedy, Vicar of Teston, Kent, and a descendant of the Cassilis family in Scotland. Andrew Hume died on the 23rd of September 1849 at his daughter's home, Glenrock, at Marulan in New South Wales, aged 87. So for the day, they both lived very long lives. They had 5 children all up, and they were amongst the first free-born white children to be born in the colony. The eldest was Hamilton. So Hamilton Hume was born on the 19th of June 1797 in Sydney. In August 1814, at the age of 17, Hamilton made his first journey of exploration. With his brother John and an Aboriginal boy, they reached the Birrima Bongbong district. In the next 2 years, Hamilton, leaving the youthful John at home, made 2 more successful journeys to the same district and penetrated as far as the Bungonia district. He spent the greater part of the next 11 years in exploration work, growing intimately acquainted with the Aborigines and finding his way through the bush without a compass. At the request of Governor Macquarie, Hume in 1818 accompanied Charles Throsby and James Meehan, a surveyor, to the new country, virtually the area already referred to, but taking in more of the county of Argyll. The party split up. Hume and Meehan pressed on and discovered Lake Bathurst and the Goulburn Plains. Throsby discovered Lake Meehan and traced the course of the Mulwaree River for some distance, while Hume made an excursion to the Gourock Range. Rejoining for the return journey, they passed close to the site of what is now Goulburn. In the next year, Hume accompanied John Oxley and Meehan to Jervis Bay. Hume and Meehan, who worked well together, returned to overland. Charles Throsby was Hamilton's brother-in-law's stepfather. Charles Throsby and John MacArthur next sought Hume's services as a guide to the Bongbong district, and in 1821-1822, Hume, accompanied by his brother-in-law George Barber and W.H. Broughton, discovered the Yass Plains. The party had gone to the Gunning district to establish a station. The W.H. Broughton who's referred to here is William Henry Broughton, who I covered in episode 42, Rose Lodge. In November 1821, the following account of Mr. Hamilton Hume's late tour. Mr. Hume left Appin accompanied by Mr. J. Kennedy, Mr. Edward Simpson, John Moon, servant to Mrs. Broughton, and 2 black natives named Jewel and Cow Pasture Jack for the purpose of selecting land for the county of Argyll. They passed Mr. Dangar, the deputy surveyor, who was then encamped on the farm of Charles Wright, on the 29th of November. When near Mr. Jenkins's establishment, they were joined by a 3rd native named Udar Duck, who accompanied them to Lake Bathurst, at which place Mr. Hume suddenly left the party and, accompanied by the natives Udar Duck and Cow Pasture Jack, on the 25th of November, set out on foot with 9 pounds of flour and went to the top of a high hill some miles southeast side of Shoalhaven River, not more than 30 miles from the coast at Jervis Bay. Mr. Hume left a mark of his having been there and returned to Mr. Jenkins's establishment on the 30th November and to Appin about the day stated. In 1822, Lieutenant Johnston, Alexander Berry and Hume reached the Clyde River. Penetrating its upper reaches, Berry and Hume moved inland almost to the side of Braidwood. For these services, Hume received a grant of 300 acres at Appin, and it was there he built his first home. It was Berry who brought together Hume and Captain William Hovell for what was to be Hume's most famous and fruitful journey to Port Phillip and back in 1824-1825. Hume agreed to lead a party overland to Spencer's Gulf, but was unable to finance the journey wholly himself. As the government backing was not forthcoming, he was on the point of abandoning the project when Hovell offered to accompany him and share the cost. Hovell, an English sea captain 11 years older than Hume, had settled on a grant at Newrallen. He had little experience in the bush but could navigate. The government contributed a few bare essentials, a tent, a tarpaulin, pack saddles, firearms and ammunition, but everything else was provided equally by the 2 men. They each brought 3 assigned servants with them. Due to the lack of the government's contribution, they had a bone of contention initially, but by mutual consent they decided their objective was changed to Western Port. On the 17th of October 1824, a fortnight after leaving Hume's home at Appin, the impassable country of Goulburn was reached. The party spent 3 days attempting to cross the Great Dividing Range at Mount Disappointment, but were thwarted. Hume shifted the direction to the west and then reached Lower Land, the future township of Broadford, on the 12th of December, where they camped. Hume headed towards low ranges to the south and found a pass in that direction the next day. He led a party across the Dividing Range at Hume's Pass Wandong on the 16th of December 1824 and reached Port Phillip Bay at Bird Rock, Point Lilius, adjacent to the future Geelong. Hovell claimed that he measured their longitude on the same day, but in reality he read it off a sketch map that he and Hume had drafted themselves during the trip. Later on, in 1867, Hovell admitted that he did not take any longitude measurements and blamed Hume for it. Prior to this admission, Dr. William Bland, who wrote the first book on their journey in 1831, invented the myth that Hovell had made an area of 1 degree in longitude in order to protect him. On their journey down, they discovered 5 rivers. The first was the Tumut, discovered on the 22nd of October. The second river, they named the Hume River after Hume's father, which is now known as the Murray, and that was discovered on the 16th of November. 4 days later, the third river, the Midda, was discovered. On the 24th of November, the Ovens River was named after Major Ovens, the private secretary to the Governor of New South Wales. And the fifth river on their way down towards Port Phillip, they named the Howe River, that was afterwards known as the Goulburn, and that was discovered on the 3rd of December. The party left Port Phillip on the 18th of December to turn back towards New South Wales. Hume chose to travel more to the west to avoid the mountainous country, and it saved considerable time. On the 16th of January 1825, just as their flour ran out, they reached the carts that they had left behind them, and 2 days later they reached the safety of Hume's station at Gunning. Hume, in a letter dated on the 24th of January 1825, so immediately after their return, practically claimed to have been the leader of the party. He writes a letter to Brisbane, and it says, "The expedition Your Excellency was pleased to entrust to my care." But Brisbane did not accept the view of it, as in a letter to the Secretary Wilmot Horton dated on the 24th of March 1825, he mentions, "The discovery of new and valuable country by 2 young men, Hovell and Hume, they were directed by me to try and reach Spencer's Gulf." It may be pointed out that in the letter to Brisbane before they went on the 28th of July 1824, Hovell signed first. These facts are of interest in view of the controversy that broke out many years later. Hume and Hovell each received grants of 1,200 acres of land each as a reward for the discoveries of great importance made by the expedition. However, it was seen as an inadequate reward because, practically speaking, they paid their own expenses. Due to the expenses that Hume accrued, he had to sell a fine iron plough to pay for essentials even before setting out. Hamilton Hume married Elizabeth Dyte, who was from Windsor, by Reverend W. Cowper at Sydney on the 9th of November 1825, a licence having been obtained for the marriage on the 31st of October 1825. In 1827, accompanied by Lieutenant George Bowen, then the Assistant Surveyor, Hume explored the western part of the Blue Mountains, around the landform that he named the Darling Causeway after Governor Ralph Darling, and founded 3 passes through the western escarpment that would have avoided the steep Mount York route. During this period, he named Lithgow Valley after William Lithgow, who at the time was the Auditor General of New South Wales. And it was in this expedition that Hamilton met and took on an Aboriginal wife. She called herself Nellie Hamilton and took his first name on as her surname. This is when Hamilton Hume discovered Lake Nungara, and he renamed it Lake George. And he joined the local Aboriginal tribe for weeks, learning their bush skills and living like they did off the land. At this time, Nellie and Hamilton joined together in a Ngunnawal traditional ceremony. Some of the elders didn't like it and spoke their mind, and a count of hands was required from the tribe before the traditional ceremony was allowed to go ahead. Nellie Hamilton was born at Ginninderra. She was highly intelligent and articulate, including in English, and she was a frank advocate on behalf of her people. When questioned about the invasion, Indigenous disposition and European laws, she's quoted as providing the following response. "You come and take our land, kill our game and let us starve, and if we take a sheep or kill a calf, you shoot us or put us in jail. You bring your disease and give it to us. We had nothing like that until you came and stole our land. You give us rotten blankets and bad rum." A year passed by, and then Hamilton visited Nellie and discovered that in 1828 Nellie had given birth to a daughter, Lucy, who was named Lucy Hamilton Hume, near Yass in New South Wales. Her hair was reddy black, her skin was brown and in between black and white, and an old newspaper clipping stated that if she didn't tell you that she was Aboriginal, you wouldn't tell the difference. It's also said that her eyes were emerald green. The Clans people hadn't seen anything like the baby before. Her colouring was different from the black dusty look of the other children about the camp. The elders called a meeting to decide what could be done to change the colour of her skin, and they finally came to a decision that the baby had to be smoked over a fire with no heat. Hamilton arrived as the event was taking place, and he was aghast and took Lucy to his property at Gunning and gave her to an old couple of Aboriginals that roamed the station to bring her up. And I'm still unaware of whether Lucy actually knew of her parentage throughout her life. By November 1828, the census records state that Hamilton Hume, now 31, was a farmer at Appin and living with his wife Elizabeth at the farm at Appin, who was 26. So he's taken his daughter to Gunning, the Gunning property, not the Appin property. In November 1828, Hume journeyed with Charles Sturt into western New South Wales, where they found the Darling River. And on this trip, Hume showed his ability to work well and enthusiastically under a man that he liked and respected. They became lifelong friends, and Hume's ability to handle the Aboriginals was never best illustrated than on this journey. Hume was able to communicate with some Aboriginals they met early in their journey, and they consented to act as guides. And later, when the Aboriginals left them, Sturt speaks with appreciation of Hume's ability to track their animals which had strayed. Being a drought year and in constant struggle to find water, only good bushmanship saved the party. Sturt would have liked Hume to go with him on his second expedition, which started at the end of 1829. However, Hume's health had been impaired by the rigours of the journey with Hovell, and he now had to consider his wife and his future. He had a harvest to get in, and he was unable to make arrangements. And at this time, this is when Hume completed his work as an explorer and spent the rest of his working days as a successful pastoralist. Hume ended up taking up large tracts of land in the Yass district, including the properties Urally, Humewood and Marchmont. In 1839, he bought and extended the 100-acre Cooma cottage on the outskirts of Yass, on the Yass River. A few years later, he commandeered the eldest son of his youngest brother, Francis Rawdon Hume, to take over the management of the holdings, and they worked amicably for 2 decades, laying the foundations of a merino stud that was not dispersed until 1914. In 1853, Hovell visited Geelong, and he was feted as the discoverer. Reports of this reached Hume, and he was so incensed by what he considered a playing down of his part in the 1824 journey that he rushed into print. He created a pamphlet entitled A Brief Statement of Facts in Connection with the Overland Expedition from Lake George to Port Phillip in 1824, which was published in Sydney in 1855. This gave Hume's version of events that took place on the journey and the part played by Hovell. Evidence in support of Hume was given by 3 of the assigned servants, Angel and Fitzpatrick, who were Hume's servants, and Boyd, the servant of Hovell. It was a damning indictment and could not fail to injure Hovell in the eyes of the public. Hovell retaliated with a reply and thereafter remained silent. It was an unhappy, pointless quarrel which destroyed any friendship between Hume and Hovell and the success of the journey that it engendered. In 1860, Hamilton Hume was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He became a magistrate and attended to his duties in Yass almost to the day of his death. An Anglican, he was a foundation trustee at St Clement's Yass and other institutions in the township. And as the years advanced, his health declined. Another pointless quarrel resulted in the parting of him and his nephew in 1865. And from then on, Hume's deterioration was rapid. Almost totally deaf, with a failing memory, and now obsessed with the idea that his place in the 1824 expedition had not been restored in the public's estimation, he was preparing a second edition of his statement when he died at his home, Cooma Cottage, Yass, on the 19th of April 1873. Hume's work as an explorer was done by the time he was 31. He had to contend with the contempt of authority as he was colonial born. Such recognition and remuneration as he received stemmed entirely from his own energy, resources and determination, particularly with the 1824 journey. By nature, he was generous and genuinely fond of his many nieces and nephews, most of whom benefited from his will. Hume is commemorated by the Hume Highway, the principal road between Sydney and Melbourne. Hume and Hovell were also commemorated by having their portraits printed on the Australian £1 note between 1953 and 1966. The Canberra suburb of Hume was named after him, as well as the Federal Electoral Division of Hume. The City of Hume, an outer metropolitan council in Melbourne, formed in 1994, is named in his honour. In 1976, a postage stamp bearing the portraits of Hume and Hovell were issued by Australia Post. And the Hume and Hovell track, a 440-kilometre trail between Yass and Albury, also bears their joint names. And Hamilton's siblings? The second child born in the family was Isabella, and she was born on the 13th of December 1798 in Sydney. Isabella married George Barber, who was mentioned earlier, of Glenfield Farm, Liverpool, on the 6th day of February 1815. George had come out to the country free on the Bloxonbury. In the 1814 census, they were living on their property in the county of Argyll. They had 800 acres, 60 cleared and 40 cultivated, 12 horses, horned cattle and 1,800 sheep. They had 13 children, and Isabella died at their home Glenrock at Marulan, New South Wales on the 5th of August 1855 at the age of 56. The third child, John Kennedy Hume, who was mentioned going with his brother on his first exploration, was born at Toongabbie in 1800. He was known to friends and family as Happy Jack. He married Elizabeth O'Neill in 1825 in Sydney, who was known as Lizzie. And John died on the 20th of January 1840, aged only 40 years, at Gunning. John and Lizzie had a property that they called Collingwood at Gunning. There was a report in the paper of his death. Mr. John Hume, hearing the report of shots and justly conceiving that the house of his neighbour, John Cooper of Gunning, on the Yass Road was being attacked by bushrangers, he called on his servants to accompany him in order to assist and protect his neighbours. On reaching Mr. Cooper's, they found there were 3 armed bushrangers. One of them immediately asked who Mr. Hume was, and Mr. Hume asked who they were. The answer he received was a ball from a gun or a pistol. He then was fired at by a second and third shot, all of which passed through different parts of his body. Mr. Hume's servants were either very great cowards or badly armed, and it's perhaps owing to one or both of these causes that the whole of the bushrangers made their escape. The account of his death having reached his residence, a cart was dispatched for his body, still warm and reeking with blood. Here was a sight for his disconsolate family. A wife and 8 children, the greater number of the latter even being little females, all of whom are now deprived of a father and protector. He lost his life while endeavouring to assist his neighbour, and he may be thus called a martyr to charity. The bushrangers detained his body for some hours. A memorial was erected by his brothers Hamilton and F.R. Hume, Francis Rawdon Hume, and it's called the Hume Tomb, 1840. John Kennedy Hume, brother of Hamilton Hume, rode into Gunning on the 20th of January as Whitton's bushrangers were attacking the town. The gang ambushed him and he was shot dead. Whitton was captured a few days later and hanged. The brothers erected this tomb with the insertion on top that reads, "Brothers, forget not me and mine, to the memory of John Kennedy Hume, who was barbarously murdered at Gunning whilst rendering assistance to his neighbours to capture a party of bushrangers headed by the notorious Whitton. He left a widow and 9 young children to bewail his loss. This monument was erected to his memory by his affectionate brothers." And in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 8th of May 1939, the story was told by Mr. E.H. Barber, and it says, "My grandfather, the late John Kennedy Hume of Collingwood Gunning, owned a sheepdog, Frantic. Frantic was especially devoted to his master, and my grandmother, Mrs. Hume, was never anxious when Frantic was her husband's mate in the lonely bush rambles that he often indulged in. She said to her children, 'Frantic would let me know if anything happened to your father.' About the year 1839, during a raid by bushrangers on the then small town of Gunning, Mr. Hume was fatally shot. Poor Frantic missed his master terribly and was not to be comforted. When missing the dog, he was always to be found by the grave of his master, wailing for him and looking for his return. 6 months after my grandfather's death, early one morning, after a bitterly cold and frosty night, poor Frantic was found dead. He jumped over the picket enclosure and was found dead on his master's grave. He was buried at the foot of a wattle tree not far away. This true story of the love and grief of this faithful dog for his friend is still a record in the family after the lapse of nearly 100 years. Lizzie was pregnant with their 9th child at the time her husband was killed. British law wouldn't allow Lizzie to keep the land grant that she had with John. The ruling was that her firstborn child was illegitimate, and so therefore she wasn't able to honour the land grant. So Hamilton helped Lizzie relocate to a run in northern Victoria. They were the first white people to settle there, and they built Birramine Homestead near Yarrawonga that stands in the middle of 85,000 acres. The gold rush meant that Lizzie's land grant was mostly rescinded, but she was allowed to keep the house. Her children sold the house after her death, and she became known, due to her husband's aristocratic Scottish clan links, as the First Lady of Yarrawonga, and she's buried in the Corowa Cemetery. The fourth child, as mentioned on his brother's memorial, was Francis Rawdon Hume, and he was born in Sydney on the 13th of November 1803. In the Hawkesbury floods, Mrs. Hume and Francis, as an infant, were found floating on nothing but a feather bed and were rescued in a pig trough. Francis was a farmer in Appin in 1828, and he married Emma Mitchell, the daughter of Mr. William Mitchell of Argyle, Sydney, on the 12th of October 1828, and they had 14 children. In the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser on the 17th of September 1829, it mentions an article titled Cattle Stealing, and this gives a good insight into Francis and how brave he was, but also I think it would have had a lot to do with the fact that his brother had been shot by bushrangers. Mr. Francis Rawdon Hume was induced on Tuesday evening to collect a body of men and be well armed, placed himself at the head of the party and crossed Tuggerah Creek. They proceeded to and explored the tract of land on the other side that has numerous ravines, deep gullies and very thick scrubs, and is a secure retreat for cattle stealers and bushrangers. The attention of the party was occupied the whole of the day tracing up and down the rocks, and in the centre of the gullies, the recent track of men and horned cattle, which evidently had passed that way. The next morning the party set out, accompanied by an active constable, Larragee. At 11 a.m. they passed an unoccupied hut that had been about 13 or 14 months inhabited by a gang of robbers, one of whom at that time had been wounded and taken prisoner by Hume, and the rest with difficulty escaped. In the afternoon they came across another uninhabited hut, adjoining which was the skeleton of a beast, together with a heap of burnt bones, and a short distance they found part of a hide and the head of a bullock, which in its appearance had been killed a short time before. At 3:30 they entered a gully far more intricate and deeper than they had passed before. Here they found fresh water. They proceeded through the bed of this gully for 3/4 of a mile, when Mr. Hume, who was ahead of the party, heard a man singing. He made signs to the rest to follow him. Mr. Hume quickened his pace and had not advanced far when a dog barked, and immediately a man with a musket in his hand rushed out of a cave. The constable called on him to surrender, and the man would not, and ran as fast as he could towards the water. On the other side was a thick, scrubby brush. The man arrived at the edge of the water and plunged in, and as he was getting up the bank on the opposite side, the constable and Mr. Hume again called out to him to surrender or they would fire. The man would not, and the constable fired. The man then stumbled and dropped the musket, but instantly recovered his legs and scampered off. Mr. Hume pursued him for 200 yards into the brush, and finding he was likely to escape, he desired him to stop or he would fire. The man kept running, now and then looking behind him, and Mr. Hume fired and the man fell. Having secured their prisoner, whose name is Patrick Burke, a notorious outlaw, they returned with the party to the cave, where they found a steel mill, a brass wire flour sieve, cups and saucers, plates and dishes, knives and forks, buckets and pots, wearing apparel and bedding, plenty of tea, sugar, tobacco, snuff, maize grain and wheaten meal, and a quantity of beef that had recently been salted. Near the cave were parts of carcasses of 2 stolen beasts, a great heap of feathers which no doubt did belong to the poultry stolen from the settlers. The party, at the suggestion of Mr. Hume, destroyed the utensils and burnt whatever could be consumed, as it was impossible to convey the property. They afterwards made a litter to convey the wounded man with them, but night coming on they could not carry him far, and were compelled to remain there till the next morning, when Mr. Hume procured a horse, and having brought the man to Campbelltown, delivered him to the authorities. This is not the second or third instance wherein this young gentleman has risked his life for the peace and welfare of surrounding districts, as well as rendering the police an essential service. It is owing to his knowledge of the bush, together with his personal exertions, that several of the most abandoned characters who have been the terror of this and other districts have been captured, but who have lately paid the forfeit of their lives to offender justice. The prisoner Burke acknowledged that he lived in the cave for 13 months and 7 days, but he would not confess who his associates were, saying he had been supplied with every necessity he required by free men living near Campbelltown. Francis Rawdon Hume died at his property Castle Steeds at Burrawa, New South Wales, aged 85. He'd been a resident in the district for 40 years and was held in high estimation. And the fifth child, Andrew Hume, died at 15 months old on the 15th of October 1808. He died from the result of a fall received when his oldest brother Hamilton was playing with him. And Nellie Hamilton? Well, Nellie's next partner was Bobby Hamilton, a talented Ginadera stockman, horsebreaker and cricketer in the employ of William Davis Jr. He also seems to have worked for Florence McAuliffe, a Ginadera blacksmith. Bobby was a Ngurumbi man who was born in 1830. Bobby achieved fame as a cricketer, but was less successful in 1863 when, following the robbery of the Borough mail coach, he acted as a black tracker and was roundly blamed by Captain Batty for the escape of the robbers. They had 2 children. Both of them died in the measles epidemic. Eddie was born in 1856 and they had another girl, Millie, as well. In 1873, Bobby died of tuberculosis despite attempts to save him in the Queanbeyan Hospital. In that year, Nellie and a close friend, Ju Nin Mingo, known as Nanny, were imprisoned for a week for defaulting on a fine for being intoxicated. On a trip to Cooma to visit the Ngurungaru people, she and Nanny were refused a free passage on the mail coach and decided to walk many days through the winter weather. Not long after this trip, Nanny died as a result of the rigours of the journey. Later that year, John Breen took a horse that Nellie had tied up at a hotel where she was employed as a cleaner. He sold the horse to George Rolfe. She lodged a written claim against Rolfe as the unlawful owner and took him to court in March 1874 and won the case but was not awarded any compensation. Nellie seems to have not lived in Ginadera for long after Bobby died, spending most of her time in the greater Queanbeyan area. In the late 1870s, she appears to have resided in the Braidwood area. Her last 2 husbands, Parson Williams and King Billy, were both from that area. King Billy, or Jimmy Clements, was born in 1847 and was a Wiradjuri man. He is known for walking nearly a week from near Gundagai to attend the opening of the old Parliament House in 1927, only to be told by police to move on due to his attire. The crowd insisted that he stayed, however, and he became among those presented to the Duke and Duchess of York. His actions are the first recorded Aboriginal protest at Parliament. King Billy died in that same year. In 1888, Harold Mapletoft Davis and the Queanbeyan Council applied to the Aboriginal Protection Board to have Nellie's leadership as a Ngunnawal elder recognised through the awarding of a brass breastplate. The application was successful, and she became widely known thereafter as Queen Nellie. She was invited as one of the dignitaries to oversee the opening of the Tharwa Bridge on the 29th of March 1895. There is no known photo of Queen Nellie Hamilton with her brass plate. However, before the public crossed the bridge following its opening, there was a photo of Queen Nellie Hamilton, resplendent in her new silk gown acquired for the occasion, where she shook hands with all the children who had lined up as part of the procession. A number of members of European families of the district recalled vivid memories of Queen Nellie. In her recollections, May Walker wrote of her that she never went anywhere without her dog Jerubung and her pipe. Everyone liked her because she was a good old soul who never did anyone harm, even in thought. Queen Nellie Hamilton died on New Year's Day, 1897, at Queanbeyan Hospital. In October 2022, Queen Nellie Hamilton is honoured with a room in the Queanbeyan Courthouse called Nellie's Room. It's designed to keep victims of domestic or sexual violence from having to face their alleged attackers when testifying. There is also a Nellie Hamilton Avenue in Gungahlin that bears her name. And Lucy Hamilton Hume? Lucy married Andy Lane, who was known as King Andy Lane. So as a result, she was known as Queen Lucy. He was a prominent figure in the Ngunnawal country, particularly of the Wallabaloa clan. In the early 1800s, he dominated southeast Australia, right down to the areas of Bega and Eden. He forged strong relationships with non-Indigenous families, the Humes, the Broughtons, the Kennedys, the Walkers and the Howes. And of course, we do know that Hamilton Hume was well aware that Lucy was his son, but at this point, whether Lucy was aware herself or her husband, King Andy, I'm not sure. Queen Lucy then moved on to have a relationship with Edward Carroll, who'd been born in Delegat, New South Wales in 1838. He'd been married to Julia Lewis previously in 1861 in Yass and had 2 boys with her, but Julia died in Tumut in 1869. Edward was known as King Ned after the commencement of his relationship with Queen Lucy, and they had a daughter, Eva Mary Carroll, in 1874 in Yass. She married Edward Grace under the name of Mary Carroll in Yass in 1900, and they had a son, Cecil, in Yass in 1902. Eva died in Redfern, New South Wales on the 15th of April 1953 at the age of 79. Cecil married Lillian May Florence Haynes in Cootamundra in 1930, and Cecil died in Cootamundra in 1982 at the age of 80. And of course these are Hamilton Hume's descendants. Another descendant that was also the son of Queen Lucy and Edward Carroll was James Leslie Carroll, and he was born on the 27th of October 1882. James married Amy Duncan in Yass in 1904. They had a son, Cyril Oswald James Carroll, born in 1920 in Yass, and then married Christina Brown in Yass in 1934. James died in 1942, aged 60. Their son Cyril fought in the AIF, and he enlisted on the 29th of November 1942 at the age of 22, and he died at Concord in New South Wales. Queen Lucy was regarded as the leading elder of the Ngunnawal people of the Yass district. Early documents refer to her as Lucy Hamilton or Lucy Hume. At the time of her birth, Hamilton Hume, his two brothers and his father, Andrew, lived in the district. Lucy fought for the right to determine her own life and for her people. Her most poignant fight was to keep her home and her family at Oak Hill when authorities forcibly removed them to the new Egerton Reserve 12 miles out of town. Faced with eviction, she sought legal advice to confirm the 23-acre land grant from Lord Carrington was hers, only to be told the grant had been revoked earlier that year. Lucy lived through displacement and disintegration of her people's way of life and means of survival. And on the 7th of October 1918, the newspaper announced that Queen Lucy was dead, Aborigine of 90 years. The death occurred recently at Yass, New South Wales, of Queen Lucy Carroll, an Aboriginal woman born in the district in the year 1828, about 4 years after explorer Hamilton Hume and his party crossed the Murray River at Albury. Lucy was therefore 90 years of age, where she's passed into the happy hunting grounds, and she's enjoyed comparatively good health up until a few months ago. Her husband, Ned Carroll, died 5 years ago. Lucy once told a newspaper man not to pass any remarks about her personal appearance. The outcome of a remark concerning the whiteness of the lady's fingertips probably caused through washing for many district families. Lucy was particular in her choice of government rations. On one occasion she visited the contracting storekeeper with a complaint that the brand of flour supplied was unsuitable. "I want good Sydney flour or I'll quick see Mr Brennan," who was the Sub-Inspector Brennan of the Yass Police. The flour was changed, and as a result of the visit of Lord Carrington to the district, a piece of land was granted at North Yass near Godfrey's Hill, where a large camp was established. Lucy had also resided in camps at Kewiths, O'Connell Town, and again at North Yass and Rye Park. When the present Aborigines Board was formed, a farm called Egerton, a few miles out of Yass, was purchased in an attempt made to form a mission there. Queen Lucy strongly objected to leaving the town with which she'd been connected for so long, and had to be taken to Egerton under police escort. On arrival there, while the constable was lunching at the missions, Lucy secured a vehicle and was back in Yass at her old haunts before the policeman even missed her. She loudly protested that Mr Government had given her a home in town, and she declined to leave it. Several attempts were made to induce her to live at the mission without success. Lucy prophesied it would be a failure, and it was so, as the board later sold the mission huts and the blacks and the half-castes returned to their former haunts. Mother of many children, she walked with a pronounced limp, the result, it was said, of the tender attentions of one of her husbands who used a waddy to correct her in the early days of her wedded life. The dusky queen was laid to rest in the Catholic portion of the Yass Cemetery. Very interesting that Hamilton Hume was mentioned in that article, but only that he had passed through 4 years prior to her birth, and that the white tips on her fingers were actually due to the laundering that she'd done over the years for people. So very interesting knowing the information that links her directly to Hamilton Hume as her father.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.